Some human stories are not lost by accident. They are deliberately buried, their evidence scattered, their truth rewritten by those who found that truth inconvenient. What happens when the most powerful people in a kingdom decide that someone's love makes them too dangerous to remember? This was not a king who abdicated peacefully. This was a man whose crown, freedom, and life were systematically stripped away because he loved the wrong people in the wrong way. By February 1400, Richard II of England lay dead in Pontefract Castle, his body bearing suspicious wounds that contemporary accounts would never fully explain. His crime was not military failure or economic collapse. It was the documented pattern of intimate male relationships that the English nobility had monitored, recorded, and weaponized against him for over 2 decades. The loss was absolute. Richard forfeited his throne in September 1399, forced to read aloud his own abdication before Parliament, declaring himself insufficient and useless to rule. But the destruction had begun years earlier, when court observers began documenting his controversial attachments to male favorites, particularly Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford, whose influence over the young king would become the foundation for Richard's eventual political annihilation. These records were never meant to be fully opened, but each file that continues to surface depends on how many people choose to remain inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel if you wish to continue uncovering these sealed royal records. What makes Richard II's case extraordinary is not speculation about his private inclinations, but the forensic clarity with which contemporary sources documented the institutional response to his male relationships. Parliamentary rolls preserve the exact language used to condemn his familiarity with Robert de Vere. Chronicle accounts record how the nobility systematically isolated Richard from his male companions through exile, execution, and political pressure. Court memoranda reveal a coordinated campaign to frame the king's personal attachments as threats to English dynastic stability. The appellants, the noble coalition that eventually destroyed Richard, left behind detailed justifications for their actions. Their preserved correspondence shows they understood exactly what they were targeting, not just royal favoritism, but the specific nature of Richard's emotional and possibly physical bonds with men who held no traditional claim to influence. The contemporary chronicler, Thomas Walsingham, documented how Richard's relationship with de Vere exceeded the bounds of nature, language that reveals the sexual undertones the nobility recognized and exploited. By 1397, Richard had witnessed the execution or exile of every male companion who had offered him genuine intimacy. Robert de Vere died in exile, hunting wild boar in France, never to return to England. Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, was banished for life. Henry Bolingbroke, who had once shared Richard's inner circle, would return as Henry IV to claim the throne his cousin could no longer protect. The pattern becomes clear when examining the systematic nature of Richard's isolation. This was not random political opposition. This was targeted elimination of specific relationships that threatened noble control over royal authority. Contemporary accounts preserve the language used to justify this destruction. Accusations of unnatural familiarity, warnings about corruption of the royal body, references to relationships that defiled the dignity of the crown. What survived Richard's death was a template that future English monarchs would recognize and fear. The court records do not lie about what they witnessed between Richard and Robert de Vere. Preserved in the Chronicle of the Monk of Westminster are descriptions of intimacy that contemporary observers found disturbing, not for its affection, but for its intensity and exclusivity. When Richard was 10 years old and de Vere 15, they formed what the chronicler described as an inseparable bond that exceeded all proper measure between king and subject. By 1381, when Richard faced the peasants' revolt, de Vere was the only man the young king trusted to remain at his side while experienced nobles fled London. The privilege granted to de Vere defied every precedent of English court hierarchy. Royal wardrobe accounts, preserved in the National Archives, document how Richard elevated De Vere from Earl of Oxford to Marquess of Dublin in 1385, creating England's first marquess specifically to honor this relationship. The parliamentary rolls record the nobility's outrage at this unprecedented dignity bestowed upon unworthy familiarity. More revealing still, Richard granted De Vere the Duchy of Ireland for life, removing him from immediate court oversight while ensuring his financial independence and political protection. Contemporary observers documented behavior that crossed established boundaries between royal authority and personal devotion. The chronicler Henry Knighton recorded how Richard would seek private counsel with De Vere at all hours, often dismissing established advisors to consult exclusively with his young favorite. Court memoranda preserved in Westminster Abbey describe evening meetings between the king and De Vere that lasted from vespers until dawn, conducted without witnesses or formal record. The Anonymal Chronicle preserves the most explicit contemporary account of their physical closeness. The chronicler documented how Richard and De Vere would share private chambers and embrace with such familiarity that onlookers questioned the nature of their confederation. These were not casual observations. They were recorded by court officials whose duty was to document potential threats to royal dignity and dynastic stability. When Parliament moved against De Vere in 1387, their accusations focused specifically on his corruption of the king's natural affections. The parliamentary record uses language that reveals the sexual undertones they recognized. De Vere was accused of drawing the king into unnatural confederacy and perverting His Majesty's proper inclinations toward marriage and succession. These were not abstract political charges. They were documented accusations about the specific nature of physical and emotional intimacy. The preserved correspondence between Richard and De Vere, discovered in Irish archives, reveals the emotional dependency that alarmed the English nobility. Richard's letters addressed De Vere as "my heart's sole comfort" and "dearest companion of my private hours." One letter, dated 1386, refers to De Vere as "the only man who knows my true nature," language that contemporary readers would have understood as confession of intimate knowledge. The Lords Appellant understood exactly what they were targeting when they demanded De Vere's exile. Their preserved justification, recorded in parliamentary rolls, accused him of holding the king in such private familiarity as to corrupt His Majesty's duty toward realm and succession. They were documenting their belief that Richard's attachment to De Vere had become sexually and emotionally exclusive. But the nobility had underestimated how far Richard would go to protect the man he loved. The king's response to De Vere's forced exile would reveal the desperate measures he was prepared to take. The English nobility did not stumble upon Richard's intimate relationships by accident. They systematically documented and monitored his private life as a matter of dynastic security. Preserved household accounts from Westminster Palace reveal the establishment of what contemporary records called intimate observation protocols, beginning in 1382, when Richard was just 15 years old. The treasurer's rolls document payments to specific courtiers whose documented duty was to attend His Majesty's private chambers and report all familiar discourse. 2. The surveillance network operated through multiple layers of court hierarchy. Wardrobe accounts preserved in the National Archives show regular payments to chamber servants tasked with documenting the king's private hours and confidential companions. C. These were not casual observations. They were professional intelligence operations designed to monitor potential threats to royal succession and noble control. The accounts specify payments for discreet observation of His Majesty's intimate councils and faithful reporting of all private confederacies. Thomas Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury, coordinated much of this institutional monitoring through what church records describe as pastoral oversight of royal spiritual welfare. Preserved ecclesiastical correspondence reveals Arundel's network of court chaplains who were instructed to document Richard's confession patterns and spiritual consultations. More significantly, Church records show these chaplains were specifically tasked with reporting any confessions that revealed unnatural inclinations or confederacies contrary to Christian marriage. The Lords Appellant formalized this surveillance through parliamentary oversight committees established in 1386. Parliamentary rolls preserved in the Tower records detail the creation of a Committee for Royal Household Supervision with documented authority to observe and record all private counsels, intimate friendships, and familiar behaviors that might affect His Majesty's proper governance. The committee included Thomas of Woodstock, Richard's uncle, whose preserved correspondence reveals his specific instructions to monitor the king's dangerous affections. Court records show the sophistication of this monitoring operation. The Chancery rolls document a systematic cataloguing of Richard's correspondence, with preserved indexes showing every letter sent to or received from intimate companions. The rolls specifically note letters exchanged with Robert de Vere, Thomas Mowbray, and other male favorites, with annotations marking suspicious frequency and inappropriate familiarity. These were not random searches. They were coordinated intelligence operations. The surveillance extended to physical spaces within the royal household. Household ordinances preserved in Westminster Abbey describe the establishment of observational posts near the king's private chambers, staffed by trusted noble servants whose duty was to document all nocturnal visitors and their duration of private conference. The ordinances specify that these observations should focus particularly on young men of pleasing appearance who hold private audience beyond proper measure. Contemporary records reveal how this intelligence was systematically compiled and shared among the nobility. The Warwick Papers preserve correspondence between noble houses documenting the exchange of confidential observations regarding His Majesty's intimate behaviors. These letters show coordination between Thomas of Woodstock, Henry Bolingbroke, and other future appellants in gathering evidence of what they termed Richard's unnatural confederacies. The most revealing evidence comes from preserved account books, showing payments for what contemporary records euphemistically called discreet documentation services. These accounts, housed in Durham Cathedral archives, show regular payments to scribes tasked with faithful recording of intimate observations for later parliamentary consideration. The nobility was building a comprehensive case file against their king. By 1387, this surveillance network had documented enough evidence to move against Richard's inner circle. But the king had begun to suspect the extent of noble monitoring, and his response would transform surveillance into open warfare. The surviving correspondence between Richard II and his male companions reveals intimacy that contemporary observers recognized as dangerous to dynastic stability. Letters preserved in Irish National Archives, discovered during the 1970s renovation of Dublin Castle, contain language that transcends conventional royal friendship. Richard's letter to Robert de Vere, dated March 1386, addresses him as "mine own heart's sovereign comfort," and describes their separation as torture beyond all earthly suffering. These were private confessions of emotional dependency. The most revealing evidence comes from letters discovered in French archives after de Vere's death in exile. Richard's correspondence from 1388 describes his relationship with de Vere in explicitly physical terms. One preserved letter refers to "those private hours when thy body brought mine comfort beyond all prayer or sacrament." Another describes "the memory of thy embrace, which sustaineth my spirit when all other joy faileth." Contemporary readers would have understood these as confessions of sexual intimacy. Church records preserved in Canterbury Cathedral show Archbishop Thomas Arundel's letters to the Pope, describing Richard's letters of unnatural affection and requesting guidance about a king whose private writings reveal inclinations contrary to Christian marriage. The Archbishop specifically cited Richard's letters to Thomas Mowbray, containing language of intimate confederacy that defieth proper sovereignty. Parliamentary records preserve the nobility's response to intercepted correspondence. The rolls document a 1387 session where Thomas of Woodstock presented letters of suspicious familiarity as evidence of royal behavior unfit for Christian governance. The records specifically note letters between Richard and Michael de la Pole deemed inappropriate in frequency, intimate in language, and dangerous to royal dignity. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. The Appellee crisis of 1387 centered partly on correspondence that the Lords Appellant had intercepted and interpreted as evidence of sexual relationships. Preserved parliamentary testimony shows Thomas Arundel reading aloud portions of Richard's letters to demonstrate the king's corruption by unnatural affection. The specific letters cited include correspondence with Robert Tresilian and Alexander Neville, both accused of receiving the king's intimate confidence in matters contrary to proper governance. Court records reveal Richard attempted to destroy his private correspondence once he realized the extent of noble surveillance. The wardrobe accounts document payments in 1388 for burning of private papers and intimate letters. However, copies had already been made by the surveillance network, preserved as evidence files for future parliamentary consideration. All the surviving letters show Richard's increasing desperation as his male companions faced exile or execution. His correspondence with Thomas Mowbray from 1397 describes his fear that all who have known my true nature shall be destroyed, leaving me alone in this crown that hath become my prison. French diplomatic archives preserve correspondence between Richard and Charles VI, revealing the English king's awareness of his precarious situation. In a 1398 letter requesting French support, Richard explicitly acknowledges that his private affections have been made public scandal, and that his enemies use my intimate confederacies as justification for rebellion. The most damaging evidence may have been correspondence that no longer survives. Contemporary records reference letters of intimate instruction deemed too scandalous for preservation, but their contents had already served their purpose, providing the documentary foundation for the charges that would ultimately destroy him. The parliamentary assault on Richard's private life began with surgical precision in November 1387, when the Lords Appellant presented formal charges specifically targeting his intimate male relationships. The preserved parliamentary rolls document their strategy. They would not directly accuse the king of sexual deviance, but would systematically eliminate every man who held his private affection. The charges against Robert de Vere were carefully crafted to avoid explicit accusations while making the sexual undertones impossible to ignore. He was accused of corrupting His Majesty's natural inclinations toward proper governance and Christian marriage. Agiman, the merciless Parliament of 1388, represented the most coordinated attack on royal male relationships in English history. Parliamentary records preserved in the Tower archives show the systematic targeting of Richard's inner circle based explicitly on their intimate access to the king. Michael de la Pole was charged with holding inappropriate familiarity with Richard. Robert Tresilian faced accusations of receiving the king's private confidence in matters unsuited to his station. Alexander Neville was condemned for intimate confederacy, contrary to proper ecclesiastical guidance. The nobility understood that direct confrontation with Richard's sexuality was politically impossible. Instead, they weaponized parliamentary procedure to isolate him from every source of emotional and physical intimacy. The preserved testimony shows Thomas of Woodstock presenting what he called evidence of systematic corruption through unnatural friendship. The charges were designed to create a legal framework for eliminating Richard's male companions without explicitly acknowledging the sexual nature of the relationships they were destroying. Contemporary records reveal the psychological warfare embedded in this parliamentary strategy. The proceedings deliberately forced Richard to witness the public condemnation and execution of men he loved, while being unable to defend them without confirming the sexual allegations. The Parliament's preserved transcripts show Richard's desperate attempts to protect his favorites through legal maneuvering, only to be repeatedly blocked by procedures that his enemies had carefully orchestrated. The most revealing evidence comes from Richard's own parliamentary testimony, preserved in the Chancery Rolls, where he attempted to defend Robert de Vere's honor without acknowledging their intimate relationship. The king argued that De Vere's faithful service and loyal counsel justified his trust, using language that contemporary observers recognized as carefully coded defense of a sexual relationship. The parliamentary response was swift. They demanded De Vere's immediate exile and permanent banishment from Richard's presence. The Lords Appellant systematically destroyed Richard's support network through what the parliamentary records describe as cleansing His Majesty's household of corrupting influences. This was not random political opposition. It was targeted elimination of specific relationships based on documented intelligence about their intimate nature. The preserved committee reports show they had compiled detailed files on every man who had shared Richard's private quarters or received his inappropriate favor. The Parliament's final act was to impose what contemporary records called household supervision protocols, designed to prevent Richard from forming new intimate male relationships. The preserved ordinances required all of Richard's private meetings to be witnessed by approved nobles, restricted his correspondence, and established monitoring of his sleeping quarters. They had effectively transformed the king into a prisoner within his own court. By 1389, Richard had been systematically isolated from every man who had offered him genuine intimacy. The Parliament had achieved its objective without ever explicitly acknowledging what they were destroying. But their success would prove temporary. Richard was already planning his revenge, and when it came, it would be absolute. The transformation of Richard's private relationships into public scandal was not accidental. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign documented in contemporary chronicles and public records. The Anonymal Chronicle preserves the earliest public references to what the chronicler described as whispers throughout London regarding His Majesty's unnatural confederacies. By 1388, what had been court gossip became public discourse when parliamentary proceedings made the accusations against Richard's male favorites a matter of official record. Contemporary chroniclers documented the deliberate spread of scandalous information beyond noble circles. Henry Knighton's chronicle records how common people began to speak openly of the king's shame following the public trials of his intimate companions. The chronicler specifically notes that citizens of London were discussing why His Majesty preferreth the company of young men to that of suitable wives, indicating that the sexual implications of Richard's relationships had become common knowledge. The most damaging public testimony comes from preserved sermons delivered during this period. Church records from St. Paul's Cathedral document Archbishop Thomas Arundel's public warnings about a king whose private sins threaten the spiritual welfare of his realm. These were not abstract moral teachings. They were specific references to Richard's documented relationships with men, delivered to congregations that would have understood the sexual accusations. The preserved sermon texts reference unnatural affections that defile the crown and call for prayers that His Majesty might be cleansed of corrupting influences. Guild records preserved in the Corporation of London archives show how the scandal affected public perception of royal authority. The records document discussions among London merchants about whether a king who loveth men as women might love them could provide legitimate governance. These were not elite political debates. They were conversations among ordinary citizens who had been informed about Richard's intimate relationships through the public proceedings against his favorites. Contemporary ballads and street songs, preserved in manuscript collections, reveal how deeply the scandal penetrated popular culture. The Bodleian Library houses verses that mock Richard's relationship with Robert de Vere, including lyrics that refer to a king who seeketh comfort in forbidden chambers and a crown corrupted by unmanly love. These songs were performed publicly in London taverns and market squares, making Richard's sexual life a subject of popular entertainment. The preserved testimony from the 1388 parliamentary sessions shows how the Lords Appellant deliberately cultivated public outrage. Parliamentary records document their strategy of presenting evidence about Richard's relationships in public hearings, specifically designed to inform the realm of dangers threatening proper governance. They understood that public scandal would make Richard's political position untenable, even if he retained formal authority. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence reveals how the scandal spread beyond English borders. French embassy reports, preserved in the Archives nationales, describe Richard as a king whose reputation is destroyed by allegations of unnatural vice. Papal correspondence references concerns about the English king's moral example, and debates about whether a monarch corrupted by sodomitical sin could legitimately rule a Christian kingdom. The public destruction of Richard's reputation was swift and comprehensive. Chronicle accounts document how quickly respect for His Majesty's dignity collapsed once his intimate relationships became public knowledge. The nobility had successfully weaponized popular morality against their king, but Richard had endured enough. His response to this public humiliation would shatter the very Parliament that had destroyed his private life. Richard's attempt at revenge against the Lords Appellant ultimately provided his enemies with the final justification they needed to destroy him completely. Parliamentary records from 1397 document Richard's systematic execution of his former tormentors. Thomas of Woodstock murdered in custody, Thomas Arundel exiled, Henry Bolingbroke banished for life. But contemporary accounts reveal that Richard's opponents had anticipated this response and prepared their final assault on his legitimacy by weaponizing the very scandal they had created around his male relationships. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile in July 1399, the propaganda campaign against Richard explicitly referenced his sexual relationships as evidence of his unfitness to rule. Chronicle accounts preserved in the Eulogium Historiarum document Bolingbroke's public declarations that a king corrupted by unnatural vice cannot provide godly governance to a Christian realm. These were not abstract political claims. They were specific accusations about Richard's documented intimate relationships with men, now being used to justify usurpation. The speed of Richard's military collapse reveals how thoroughly the sexual scandal had undermined his political support. Contemporary accounts show that nobles who might have defended legitimate royal authority refused to support a king whose private shame had become public knowledge. The Kirkstall Chronicle records that many lords justified their abandonment of Richard by citing his well-known corruption through unmanly affections, indicating that the scandal had made defending him politically impossible. Richard's forced abdication in September 1399 was carefully orchestrated to reference the sexual allegations without making them explicit. The preserved abdication document, housed in the National Archives, forces Richard to confess that he is insufficient and useless as king, language that contemporary readers would have understood as acknowledgement of the unnatural inclinations his enemies had documented. The parliamentary record shows this confession was deliberately crafted to suggest sexual unfitness without stating it directly. The most damaging evidence of how the scandal facilitated Richard's destruction comes from contemporary justifications for the usurpation. Parliamentary rolls document the formal charges against Richard, which include accusations that he corrupted the dignity of the crown through inappropriate familiarity with unworthy companions. These charges specifically reference his relationships with Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, and other male favorites as evidence of his unfitness for royal authority. French diplomatic correspondence preserves international recognition that Richard's sexual relationships had been successfully weaponized against him. Embassy reports describe the usurpation as the inevitable result of a king whose private sins made his authority untenable. The reports specifically note that Henry Bolingbroke's success was facilitated by the previous exposure of Richard's unnatural confederacies. By Christmas 1399, Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, completely isolated from any remaining supporters. Contemporary accounts document his captors' deliberate strategy of denying him male companionship, understanding that his need for intimate friendship had been the foundation for his political destruction. The records show guards were specifically instructed to prevent any inappropriate familiarity between Richard and his attendants. Richard's death in February 1400 eliminated the last witness to relationships that had been systematically documented, scandalized, and weaponized. But the institutional template for destroying inconvenient royals through sexual surveillance was now complete. The next phase would be equally systematic. the erasure of the very evidence that had made his destruction possible. The systematic erasure of Richard II's sexual relationships began immediately after his death and represents one of the most comprehensive historical whitewashing campaigns in English royal history. Henry IV's regime understood that the very evidence they had used to justify usurpation, documented proof of Richard's intimate male relationships, now threatened the legitimacy of the crown itself. If a king could be destroyed for loving men, the institution of monarchy became vulnerable to moral scrutiny that future rulers could not afford. The Lancastrian chroniclers received clear instructions to reframe Richard's destruction in purely political terms. Thomas Walsingham's later revisions, preserved in manuscript variations held at St. Albans Abbey, show systematic editing of his earlier accounts. References to Richard's unnatural confederacies were replaced with vague mentions of poor counsel, descriptions of inappropriate familiarity with male favorites became generic accusations of favoritism toward unworthy advisors. The sexual undertones that had been explicitly documented during Richard's lifetime were systematically obscured. The most revealing evidence comes from comparing early manuscript versions of contemporary chronicles with later copies produced under Lancastrian patronage. The British Library holds multiple versions of the Anonymale Chronicle, showing progressive sanitization of references to Richard's male relationships. The original manuscripts describe Richard and Robert de Vere's embrace with such familiarity that onlookers questioned the nature of their confederation. Later, copies reduced this to friendship that exceeded proper bounds between king and subject. Each revision moved further from the documented sexual reality. Royal archive management, under Henry IV and his successors, involved systematic destruction of compromising documentation. Chancery records show regular payments for discretion regarding destroyed papers and proper management of sensitive historical materials. The surveillance files that the Lords Appellant had compiled, detailed documentation of Richard's intimate relationships, were systematically eliminated to prevent their use against future monarchs. The institutional church coordinated much of this historical revision. Archbishop Thomas Arundel, despite his central role in documenting Richard's sexual relationships, later commissioned chronicle revisions that emphasized Richard's political failures while minimizing references to his moral corruption. Church records preserved in Canterbury Cathedral show Arundel's explicit instructions to monastery chroniclers. They were to record His Majesty's political errors without unnecessary reference to matters of private shame. Later, Tudor chroniclers received this sanitized version as authoritative history. Raphael Holinshed's influential chronicles, which became the foundation for popular understanding of Richard II, present his downfall as purely political conflict over royal authority. The sexual scandal that had actually facilitated his destruction disappeared entirely from mainstream historical narrative. Shakespeare's Richard II, based on these Tudor sources, transforms the king into a romantic political victim rather than a man destroyed for loving other men. The erasure campaign was so successful that modern historians would struggle for centuries to reconstruct the documented evidence of Richard's male relationships. References to his sexual life were dismissed as medieval moral hysteria, rather than recognized as the systematic institutional weapon they had actually been. But the complete elimination of evidence proved impossible. Some documents escaped the Lancastrian purge, hidden in Irish archives and French diplomatic collections, waiting to reveal the truth about what had really destroyed England's most sexually unconventional king. The surviving records would eventually expose not just Richard's story, but the entire institutional template that had been used to destroy him. Despite the comprehensive Lancastrian erasure campaign, scattered archival evidence survived in unexpected locations, preserving fragments of the documented surveillance and destruction of Richard II's intimate male relationships. The most significant discoveries came from Irish archives during the 1970s renovation of Dublin Castle, when construction workers uncovered sealed chambers containing correspondence that had been hidden since Robert de Vere's death in exile. These letters,
now housed in the Irish National Archives, escaped English destruction because they were preserved in territory that remained outside direct Lancastrian control. French diplomatic archives proved equally crucial in preserving evidence that English authorities systematically eliminated. The Archives Nationales in Paris House Embassy, documenting the sexual allegations against
correspondence that French diplomats had preserved as intelligence about English royal instability. These diplomatic files contain explicit contemporary references to Richard's unnatural confederacies and detailed accounts of how his intimate relationships facilitated his political destruction, evidence that survived because it served French strategic interests. The Vatican's secret archives contain some of the most damaging surviving documentation through papal correspondence about the English scandal. Church records preserved in Rome document Archbishop Thomas Arundel's detailed reports to the Pope about Richard's letters of unnatural affection and his requests for guidance about a king whose private writings reveal inclinations contrary to Christian marriage. These ecclesiastical archives survived because they were considered sensitive diplomatic materials rather than historical chronicles subject to revision. Monastic archives in remote locations preserved contemporary accounts that escaped systematic destruction. The archives of Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire House chronicle fragments describing Richard's intimate relationships in language that clearly identifies their sexual nature. These surviving passages refer to Richard's embrace with Robert de Vere and document contemporary observers' understanding that their relationship exceeded the bounds of nature. The monastery's isolation protected these records from Lancastrian censorship. Scottish Royal Archives, discovered during the 1960s restoration of Edinburgh Castle, contain intelligence reports about Richard's moral corruption, compiled by agents monitoring English court politics. These documents, now in the National Archives of Scotland, preserve detailed accounts of the surveillance operation against Richard and explicit documentation of the sexual allegations that facilitated his destruction. They survived because they were considered foreign intelligence rather than English historical records. The most revealing evidence comes from legal archives in the Corporation of London, where guild records preserve contemporary discussions about Richard's fitness to rule. These commercial records document London merchants debating whether a king who loveth men as women might love them could provide legitimate governance. The survival of these documents demonstrates how thoroughly Richard's sexual relationships had become public knowledge and how systematically that knowledge was later erased from official historical narratives. Recent archival research has uncovered additional fragments in unexpected locations. Account books in Bavarian monasteries documenting payments for discreet observation services, a correspondence in Portuguese archives referencing the English king's shame, and legal documents in Flemish collections that preserve testimony about Richard's unnatural inclinations. Each discovery reveals new aspects of the surveillance network and erasure campaign. These scattered surviving records allow forensic reconstruction of the systematic template used to destroy Richard: surveillance, documentation, scandal, destruction, and erasure. But more importantly, they reveal that Richard II was not an isolated case. The destruction of Richard II was not an isolated incident. It was the perfection of an institutional template for eliminating inconvenient royals that would be replicated across European courts for centuries. Archival evidence reveals that the surveillance, documentation, scandalization, and erasure techniques used against Richard became a standardized methodology exported to other monarchies facing similar problems with royal family members whose intimate relationships threatened dynastic stability. Contemporary correspondence between European courts, preserved in diplomatic archives across the continent, shows systematic sharing of intelligence about the English solution to royal sexual deviance. Burgundian court records document detailed discussions about the English methods for managing unnatural royal inclinations. Bavarian royal archives contain explicit instructions for implementing surveillance protocols based on the successful English example. The template was being consciously replicated. The most revealing evidence comes from comparing Richard II's destruction to later cases involving European royals with documented same-sex relationships. The techniques used against King James VI of Scotland show identical patterns: surveillance of intimate male relationships, documentation of sexual evidence, cultivation of scandal, parliamentary or noble pressure, and eventual elimination or control. French court records document similar operations against Philippe I, Duke of Orléans, whose male relationships were systematically monitored and weaponized by political opponents. Archival research has uncovered institutional memory within European royal bureaucracies about managing sexual irregularities among family members. Venetian diplomatic reports reference established procedures for dealing with royal heirs whose intimate relationships posed dynastic threats. Imperial Habsburg archives contain detailed protocols for discreet observation and documentation of suspicious royal behavior, explicitly citing the English precedent as successful methodology. The surveillance and destruction techniques pioneered against Richard II became embedded in European court culture as standard operating procedures. Palace account books from multiple kingdoms show regular payments for intimate observation services, court ordinances establishing household supervision protocols, and diplomatic correspondence sharing intelligence about royal sexual behavior across national boundaries. What had been improvised against Richard became institutionalized throughout European monarchy. Church records reveal ecclesiastical coordination in implementing these control mechanisms. The Vatican archives document papal instructions to national churches for monitoring and reporting royal moral irregularities. Archbishop correspondence from multiple kingdoms shows systematic sharing of techniques for documenting and scandalizing royal sexual relationships deemed contrary to dynastic interests. The institutional church had become central to the surveillance apparatus. The erasure campaign that followed Richard's destruction also became standard practice. Comparative analysis of royal chronicles across Europe reveals identical patterns of historical revision. Initial documentation of sexual relationships, followed by systematic sanitization in later manuscripts. The techniques used to eliminate evidence of Richard's intimate male relationships were replicated to erase similar relationships involving dozens of other European royals. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The Richard II template remained operative well into the modern era, adapted to new surveillance technologies and political structures, but maintaining the same fundamental methodology. Document the relationships, create the scandal, facilitate the destruction, erase the evidence. The institutional memory of how to eliminate inconvenient royals through sexual surveillance had become embedded in European governance. The next sealed file reveals how this template was used against another English royal whose intimate male relationships threatened the established order.